Hi, and welcome to another episode of Philosopher Meets Critics. In this series, we closely engage with authors who have recently published new exciting philosophical work. The series is jointly hosted and supported by the Federal University of Bahia and CONCERT, the Cologne Center for Contemporary Epistemology and the Kantian Tradition at the University of Cologne. My name is Dario Mortini. I was a guest researcher at CONCEPT, but I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Barcelona, and I will be the host and the chair of the episode. I am delighted to introduce today's author, Mikkel Gerken, professor of philosophy at the University of Southern Denmark. His book is titled Scientific Testimony, Its Role in Science and Society, and it was published in 2022 by Oxford University Press. The book offers a wide-ranging and detailed philosophical account of scientific testimony. It also explores further issues in philosophy of science, social epistemology, and science communication. In line with the themes of the book, we are very lucky to have an excellent mix of social epistemologists and philosophers of science as commentators. Our commentators today are Professor Stanford Goldberg, Professor of Philosophy at Northwestern University, Professorial Fellow at the University of St. Andrews, and also Senior Research Associate at the University of Johannesburg. Then we have Dr. Ty Branch, who is postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Institute for Philosophy of the Leibniz University of Hanover. And finally, we have Professor Jacob Stegenga, who's Professor of Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge. In terms of format, we will start with a 15-minute overview of the book by the author, and then we will move on to the comments provided by the critics/commentators. Each commentator has roughly 15 minutes to issue their comments to the author, and then the author has up to 10 minutes to provide their response. So we'll now hand it over to Mikkel, who will give us a summary of the key points of the book. Please, Mikkel, share your screen and go ahead.
Very much, Dario. I want to spend a couple of minutes of my 15 minutes to thank all involved, both the center for hosting it, our three commentators, one of which, namely Ty, stepped in late in the game, and you, Dario, for setting the whole thing up and for running the show excellently. So I'm super excited about this. As those of you who've read the book will know, it's a big book. There's a lot of stuff going on. It was rough to write, so it's hyper exciting to have such brilliant people comment on it, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to think more about the themes of the book with you guys. All right, so the subtitle of the book is called Scientific Testimony, and its subtitle is called Its Roles in Science and Society. And that's supposed to reflect sort of a twofold ambition, namely, first of arguing that a vital part of scientific research that's based on a division of cognitive labor is testimony. It's not just testimony between scientists. It's not sort of an add-on to scientific practice. It's sort of an integral part of it, and also to argue that a critical that public scientific testimony is a critical part of the societal division of cognitive labor, at least in societies that pursue the ideals of the liberal democracy. So those are two pretty grand theses, and the idea is, of course, to motivate them, but also sort of to develop a positive picture of the roles of these types of scientific testimony and some of the norms governing the uses of these types of testimony, both within science and the working and scientific collaborations, and when science is communicated to the broader public, inclusive for purposes having to do with science-based policy and so on and so forth, right? I want to flag, and I'm particularly happy about the composition of the panel of the symposiasts here, because there's sort of an overt aim of the book was to try to integrate strands of research that have sort of traditionally been siloed up well, so sort of strands of research that I think are clearly relevant for one another, but not always brought together, right? So one sort of attempted integration is between work that's being done in the philosophy of science, for instance, work on the scientific collaboration and the division of cognitive labor and so on and so forth, and work in social epistemology having to do with the nature of testimony, the types of epistemic warrant you get when things go well from testimony. So social epistemologists have spent a lot of time obsessing about that, but have rarely taken the case of testimony within science as, or even scientific testimony to the public as sort of interesting cases. And I think they're extremely interesting cases, obviously, that can inform also the sort of foundational work on testimony. On the other hand, scientists have worked a lot on scientific collaboration, and there's been some work on the communication, for instance, semantic incorrigibility and stuff like that in the Kuhnian tradition, but it hasn't sort of been integrated with the work done in epistemology. So I think there's sort of ample room for a bidirectional illumination here, and a big part of the book is sort of to try to gain traction between that. So I'm super happy about the panel of people's coming from both science, philosophy of science, and epistemology, wanting to pursue this integration. The other methodological integration is between philosophy, general philosophical analysis, and philosophical theorizing, and empirical work, in particular empirical work from what's called the science of science communication, right? So there's a ton of high quality, really interesting empirical work being done, trying to devise the sources of science skepticism in the public, and then on that basis try to devise science communication strategies that can contribute to overcoming these challenges. And so I've found, when I sort of discovered that that body of work, I found it to be a treasure trove. It raises a host of interesting philosophical questions. It compromises some pretty natural philosophical theories of science skepticism, including, I have to say, some that I held before discovering this work. And it provides some sort of interesting avenues for developing principles for communicating and using science in the public sphere. But I also think that the direction of illumination is bidirectional in this case, right? So I think that conceptual work in philosophy, foundational work in philosophy of science and epistemology can really help criticize, evaluate, develop the science communication strategies that arise in this that are empirically based, and part of the book is trying to pursue this integration by example, namely by developing some concrete suggestions for how to communicate science to the public, especially about sort of polarizing issues. All right, so those are the main ambitions. I'll say a little bit more, right? So just some terminology. Some of you are going to refer to this, some of you are going to criticize this. So this is just sort of my basic taxonomy, right? So testimony, I take to be a type of assertion, namely a type of assertion that purports to be a ground for accepting the content of an assertion on the basis of it, and that can be scientific or non-scientific. I argue that scientific testimony is testimony that's properly based on scientific justification. This is not just a stipulative definition. This is something I dedicate arguments to. And then, of course, non-scientific testimony is testimony that's not so based on a special category of this pseudoscientific testimony, namely testimony that's not scientific but purports to be somehow, right? So, of course, an interesting category for thinking about science skepticism and so on and so forth. Among the categories of scientific testimony, I'm just going to be talking about two today, and those are the two I mainly talk about in the book, what I call intrascientific testimony, which is testimony between scientific experts that takes place in sort of in the machine room of science within scientific collaborations, right? Interscientific testimony is sort of a middle category where it's typically it's not directed at a particular scientist or public. So the paradigm here would be a publication, a conference talk, or something like just sort of when you announce to the world scientific results, but not in the process of collaboration. Of course, there are gray zones between these areas, right? And then finally, public scientific testimony is testimony that is scientific testimony that is probably based on scientific justification, but directed to non-expert, to the lay public, right? And for the purpose of the book, I have a fairly crude distinction between scientific expert testimony, where the communicator is herself an expert, a scientific expert in the domain that the testimony pertains to, and science reporting, where the testifier is not a scientific expert. So the standard case here would be a science journalist. And as some of the symposiasts will point out, this is pretty coarse-grained, and there are interesting gray zones between these things, and there are also interesting subcategories that don't fall neatly under this taxonomy, right? Okay, but let me just say a couple of things about the two main types of scientific testimony that I'll discuss, and then so we can get going, right? So the roles of scientific testimony in science, this is what I call interscientific testimony, right? So as mentioned, the main agenda here is to look for replacement to a tradition that stems from the Enlightenment, right? So the slogan of the Royal Society is "Nullius in verba," which, well, I think the exact translation is debated, but their homepage says uses "trust no one," or "don't take anybody's word for it." So that's the slogan of sort of the first prominent scientific organization, and the whole Enlightenment had this enormous focus on individual understanding, personal autonomy, being able to check and verify scientific facts for yourself rather than relying on authority, right? And of course, given that picture, testimony, interscientific testimony, would be marginalized and sort of be an add-on to scientific practice, right? So that picture has, of course, been criticized over the last decades. Philosophers of science have done a remarkable job, I think, highlighting the epistemic importance of scientific collaboration and the fine-grained specialization offered by a cognitive division of cognitive labor. So philosophers of science have argued very convincingly that these are the collaborative aspects of science are just sort of integral to its epistemic force, to why science is such a good way of investigating the world. But the sort of issue of communication, or the role of testimony in that in scientific collaboration, has been not as positively developed. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do, right? So I want to try to not just dismiss this science before testimony picture, but replace it with a positive testimony within science picture according to its scientific testimony. It's not a product of science. It's a vital part of it, right? It's a vital part of the scientific process. So that means that the norms governing scientific testimony should be regarded as scientific norms, I think, on a par with norms of science, of evidence gathering, or data analysis, or theory acceptance, or whatever other norms that philosophers, scientists are concerned with, right? So big part of the project here is sort of to develop positive norms, both for producers of interscientific testimony and consumers, that is, their collaborators, how they should respond when they hear it, right? So Yeah, sloganized, right? So observations are sort of rightly taken to be the building blocks of the scientific edifice, but scientific testimony is sort of required to unify them in a fruitful manner. So the slogan is that scientific testimony is the mortar of the scientific edifice, right? I like sometimes things get complicated, and I like to sometimes then take it back to a slogan form. All right. A bit about public scientific testimony, right? So testimony that's directed to the public laypersons, including politically legitimate decision makers. That would be your elected representative in a deliberative democracy. So this is the part of the book that's most empirical. So it draws very heavily on empirical research to diagnose science skepticism and try to identify some of the psychological and social and communicative sources of science skepticism, and it arrives at a diagnosis of that, and then one of the things I do, and one of the things I hope to sort of introduce to the philosophical community is some of the positive proposals for science communication strategies that's been developed in this field, science of science communications, right? And I sort of have a critical assessment of the state of the art. There's a number of competing science communication strategies out there. And all of them which have some positive futures, but also some problems, and I sort of have a critical assessment of the state of the art. So I'm hoping actually that these parts of the book will be apt for teaching, because they have a survey-esque character as well. But also do some constructive work, right? So I develop my own preferred overarching science communication strategy, which for both subtypes of public scientific testimony, that is for both the testimony provided by scientific expert, but also for like sort of straight up science reporting by science journalists. And the idea of the communication strategy is to recommend trying to also report the nature and strength of the underlying scientific justification for the reported hypothesis or the communicated hypothesis. Of course, this comes with feasibility constraints, but I think there's a number of ways that can be done, and I think my read of the empirical literature here is that it's actually a smart way of trying to communicate, especially polarizing stuff about socially polarizing issues where there's strong scientific justifications of issues like consequences of gun legislation or climate science research or vaccine safety research and stuff like that. Issues where there's pretty strong scientific justification, but high polarization in the public. I think this is in particular a good way of communicating science, right? And this part of the book also has some sort of more applied stuff where the rubber meets the road a little bit, right? So one thing I try to address is the sort of infamous balance norm in journalism that's largely just been copied to detrimental effect in science journalism. I try to criticize that and develop an alternative cast in the image of justification reporting. I discussed the phenomenon of trespassing testimony, which is what occurs when a legitimate scientific expert provides testimony outside of his domain of expertise. I think it's a problem in a lot of cases. And then I discussed cases, something like the communication of uncertainty, the effects on that on public uptake. All right, so I have a little bit more, but actually I think I can return to that in the discussion with Ty. So I think I will just end here and leave it to Professor Goldberg.
Thanks, Mikkel. Now Sandy is up next.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Let me just get my slides up. Give me 1 second. See if this works. Okay, there you go. Thanks so much. It's a delight to be here. I'm going to jump right into my presentation so that there's no time wasted. What I want to do today is just introduce Mikkel's project and my focus. I'm going to focus primarily on a very special part of this. I'm going to focus in particular on his account of intra-scientific testimony. I'm going to offer an alternative model that's based on Stalnacker's common ground model, but I'm going to enhance that model in ways that I've tried to argue for in other work of mine. I'm going to suggest that the enhanced model, which I'm going to call the Common Ground Plus model, offers supplemental explanations of many of the things that Mikkel takes as data. Those data actually can be explained further in ways that Mikkel doesn't explain them, but they can be explained further. That's actually meant to be if you like, a supplement to Mikkel's view. And then I'm going to suggest how the CG Plus model might actually be a potential rival to Mikkel's model. It actually can do things I think that Mikkel's can't. That's a more controversial claim. We'll see what Mikkel wants to say about that, and then I'll draw to a conclusion. So let's start just at the very beginning, where we're talking about Mikkel's project and my focus on this. Mikkel's project is to characterize the roles of scientific testimony in science and society, as he pointed out. My focus today is going to be on his characterization of the nature and features of intra-scientific testimony. He's already talked about what that is. Very briefly, it's scientific testimony aimed at other scientists as part of the project of advancing scientific research, where a testimony is scientific if and only if it's properly based on scientific justification. And a justification is scientific roughly if and only if its epistemic good-making features reflect or are constituted by, quote, scientific research, evidence, procedures, and investigations, unquote. Mikkel points out that there are three main hallmarks of scientific justification. I'm happy to take these all on board. I think they're all true claims. One, it's superior. He says in many domains, scientific justification is generally epistemically superior to non-scientific types of warrant. Second, it's gradable. Scientific justification generally comes in degrees of epistemic strength. And third, it's articulable. Scientific justification generally involves a high degree of discursive justification. I'm going to take all that on board. My claims today are going to be these. First, there is an alternative model of intra-scientific testimony deriving from an enhanced version of Stalnacker's common ground model, which was offered as a model of inquiry, although what he really meant it as was a model of inquiry-based conversation. Second, that this model can deepen some of the explanations Mikkel offers regarding intra-scientific testimony. And third, this model has some advantages relative to Mikkel's model of intra-scientific testimony. So here's the alternative model. Bear with me because some of this will be familiar to some of you, but I want to take you back to 1987 and the publication of Stalnacker's book entitled Inquiry. His aim in that book, as I'm sure the older among us remember, was modeling the present state of information of an inquiry involving various participants, and importantly, modeling the ways a state of information of such an inquiry is affected by the performance of speech acts, in particular assertions. This is important because I think it's this dimension of Stalnacker's model that lets us bring it to bear on scientific testimony. The model he offered was the common ground model. I'm just going to point out two features of that model. The first is this notion of presupposition, which is a technical term in Stalnacker's vocabulary. This characterization is one that emerged after the book in a more recent paper that he published. But we're going to use this notion. S presupposes that P, when S assumes that P or treats P as true, and S believes that it is commonly assumed that P among all other conversational participants, and that common assumption is the idea of, if you like, that used to be common belief or mutual belief, where that's the one that's supposed to have in the infinite hierarchy that many people either love or complain about. But the idea is that it's what we take for granted, and we take it for granted all the way on up. And then out of this, he builds the common ground, and the common ground is just the set of all mutual presuppositions among participants in a conversation. Those are the only technical terms I'm going to need today. What I love about the Stalnacker model is that it's extremely simple, and despite its simplicity, it is extremely powerful. So in other work, I have introduced two tweaks to this model because I think that these tweaks add power to the model. I'm going to just very briefly present them today. The first is what I call the expected common ground. Stalnacker talked about the common ground. I'm going to talk about the expected common ground. And the second tweak is I'm going to introduce a notion following a paper in 2017 by Mitch Green called types of conversation. Conversations come in types. And if you add these two ideas to Stalnacker, what you'll see is a much more powerful model. What is the expected common ground? And why think that this is a Stalnacker-inspired idea? I gave an argument for this in other work of mine. I'm going to quickly go over my argument. I'm not going to give you the full details of it because the details get very complicated, but the argument goes like this. Start off with the question, when is it reasonable to presuppose that P? That's a question that Stengenga asked in the 2002 paper of his entitled Common Ground. And the answer that he gave was, it's reasonable for one to presuppose that P in a conversation, just in case it's reasonable for one to believe that the other participants do or will presuppose that proposition. Why do I put the star after will? Because what Stengenga was interested in is the presuppositions that we make in performing speech acts. And the only way I can know whether, the only question I can have when I am presupposing that P in a speech act is not whether you do presuppose it right now, but whether you will presuppose it on observing my speech. That's what the will with an asterisk actually signifies. So again, it's reasonable for you to presuppose that P in a conversation, just in case it's reasonable for you to believe that all the other participants do or will presuppose that P. Second, if it's reasonable for a participant in C to believe that the other participants do or will presuppose it, then it is or would be uncooperative for a participant in C not to presuppose that P. This is based on the idea that cooperative participants do what is reasonable and what other reasonable people will reasonably expect them to do, in the sense of reasonably predict that they will do. If you're not doing that, you're actually not being cooperative, because you would be predicted to do that, and to fail to do what you're predicted to do, and what you're predicted to do itself is reasonable, is uncooperative. Third and final premise: participants in a conversation are entitled to assume that other participants in the conversation are cooperative. This, of course, is familiar to us from Grice. Interestingly, Stengenga explicitly accepts this in the 2002 paper. So this is to say that this is all in keeping with Stengenga. And what you get out of this, admittedly, I haven't put it in a valid form here, but it's suggestive, is the following conditional statement, which is crucial for me. If it's reasonable for you to presuppose that P in a conversation, then you are entitled to assume that the other participants in that conversation presuppose that same proposition. Why is this important to me? The common ground itself is formed by what we all presuppose and what we all recognize that we all presuppose. That means that if a single one of us doesn't presuppose a proposition, it's not in the common ground. What I want is to be able to appeal to something where I can actually hold you to task for not having treated something as in the common ground. That is precisely what the expected common ground enables me to do. So when, for example, it's reasonable for me to presuppose that P, but you don't presuppose that P, then I'm allowed to actually use the fact that I was entitled to expect you to do so, to say, hey, there was something wrong with with your participation in this conversation. You'll see why this is important in a moment. Types of conversation is the only other notion I need. This is the quote from Mitch Green. If we can find a substantive taxonomy of types of conversation, that may give interlocutors some guidance. I want to suggest that conversations are characteristically directed towards some end or other. From this teleological perspective, conversations emerge as projects that might be spread over many years, continents, or journal issues. This is crucial to me, because this is how we're going to get some of the results that I think Mikkel rightly insists that we get when we characterize intrascientific testimony. Here's what I want to take out of the idea of a type of conversation. First, and really important, for many types of conversation, there's a set of propositions associated with that type, such that insofar as they are competent, cooperative participants will take those propositions to be in the common ground of conversations of that type. Simple example: you and I are doctors. We're doing ground rounds of all of the people on our floor. It's a common practice that we all know about, that in fact we should read all of the charts of all of our patients before we enter into the ground rounds discussion. If I fail to do so, and I fail to actually presuppose some information that's in one of our mutual patients' charts, and I say something inconsistent with what's in the chart, you would likely take me to task for that. And it's no defense of myself to say, yeah, but that wasn't in the common ground, because you could quickly come back at me and say, it should have been in the common ground. You should have presupposed it. That's the idea for that first claim. I call all those propositions that meet that definition, the propositions that are in the expected common ground. And then secondly, competence in these conversations involves competence in discerning and presupposing the propositions in the expected common ground. Now, I want to say that these tweaks, both of them, should be Mikkel sanctioned. That's a technical term. It means Mikkel is not going to scream at me when I introduce these. I think he actually is already presupposing these kinds of things. Let me give you one quote that I think really nicely illustrates both of these ideas, the expected common ground and types of conversation. It goes like this. This is directly from the book. A sociologist and an anthropologist may provide intrascientific testimony about the very same hypothesis P, but they are required to provide different kinds of scientific justification for an intrascientific testimony, the P, to collaborators within their respective fields. In consequence, it's an aspect of scientific expertise to be implicitly familiar with the kind and degree of scientific justification expected in various contexts in one's discipline. Likewise, familiarity with the contextually determined justification requirements of adjacent disciplines is critical for interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary collaborations and gives rise to distinct pitfalls. Miscommunication may occur when epistemic requirements differ between disciplines. Unquote, page 113 of the book. I think Mikkel's exactly right about all of this, and I want to come back to one part of this quote. Here's the part that I want to come back to, and I want to highlight various features that I think pick up on this idea of an expected common ground and types of conversation. These parts of his quote are all indicating either that certain things are expected of you, or they're expected of you in virtue of the kind of conversation that we're having. It's the context of anthropologists talking to one another, or the context of sociologists talking to one another as sociologists, that actually introduces the conversational differences. And I think these differences are modeled beautifully by what I'm calling the enhanced common ground model. The enhanced common ground model just now is the model incorporating these two tweaks into Stalnacker's common ground model. All right, quickly now onto my application to Mikkel. I'm going to be a little bit fast here because I don't want to take more than 15 minutes. What I want to say is that this model can deepen the explanation Mikkel offers for various phenomena. This is not to disagree with Mikkel at all. It's merely to say that some of the things that he's taking for granted and trying to accommodate in his own model can be explained further and are explained further by this model. And that's because, here's my hypothesis, and this is a friendly suggestion to Mikkel, scientific testimony's features, by scientific testimony I mean in every sense that he's talking about, are just those that render it suitable for a scientific conversation of a specific subtype. So once you know that this conversation is scientific and you know its subtype, then you can predict what features it would need in order to play the role well, and those are precisely the features that Mikkel comments on. So what features are we talking about? Things like the fact that scientific testimony is aimed at a particular audience, or that there are different subtypes of scientific testimony, both intra and public facing, or that intra-scientific testimony can be taxonomized by scientific audience, or that there are characteristic challenges associated with disciplinary, multidisciplinary, and interdisciplinary research. This one is a particularly fascinating application of the Stalnacker model. I won't bother you with the details, but it's really quite interesting what you can do. Scientific testimony has a demanding epistemic norm. I think you can get that out of the model as well. I'll be coming back to this. There are normative differences between the context of discovery and the context of justification. That's a classic distinction in philosophy of science. Mikkel uses this somewhat sheepishly because he's not really sure whether he wants to sign on to that distinction. I think that distinction makes a lot of sense. The sense that you can make of it actually can be illuminated by what I'm calling the enhanced common ground model. And then finally, experts have an easier time identifying other experts in interscientific contexts. That's just because when experts talk to one another in an intra-scientific context, there's an awful lot that's in the common ground. Sorry, there's an awful lot that's in the expected common ground. And experts can tell whether other people are actually conforming to the expected common ground of their own expertise. And that's the basis of why they have an easier time identifying other experts in the intra-scientific contexts. Okay. This is a quick penultimate part. This is the part where I'm a little bit critical. I think so far, I've just been saying you can use this model to explain things that Mikkel doesn't explain. What I now want to do is say you can use this model to do things that I think Mikkel's model is going to have a hard time doing. And so this is where you might see the enhanced common ground model as a potential rival. First, I want to say that the common ground model can model and explain why scientists who proffer intra-scientific testimony are answerable to methodological, procedural, and evidential expectations. Why is that? Because they're expected to participate in certain conversations where it's the expected common ground of those conversations that expected common ground will include propositions about methodology, procedure, and evidence. Importantly, because I think Mikkel may be able to say that much, importantly, what this model can then go on to say is that if there is a scientist who offers a piece of intra-scientific testimony that's inconsistent with evidence that's in the expected common ground, then we can say that that scientist's testimony is unwarranted, whether or not the testifying scientist herself was aware of the evidence. Because even if she wasn't aware of the evidence, she should have been aware of the evidence. Why? Because it was in the expected common ground. That's part of what you can get out of this model. And I think Mikkel's model is gonna have a little bit of a harder time. Maybe in an ad hoc way you can explain it, but it's gonna have a little bit of a harder time doing this. Second of three advantages. This model can account for the justificatory demandingness of intrascientific testimony without the need to postulate a threshold rising mechanism. Now, Mikkel may not regard this as a big plus because he has in lots of his other work from the 2010s argued for a threshold rising mechanism when it comes to assertion. But it's interesting to note that we don't actually need that in order to account for the justificatory demandingness of intrascientific testimony. In particular, we can explain the justificatory demandingness of intrascientific testimony as follows. Justificatory demandingness is a function of the need to cohere with the materials in the expected common ground. And in intrascientific testimony contexts, there's a tremendous amount of evidence in the expected common ground, thereby making it harder to assert things warrantedly. You actually have to assert things that are going to cohere with all of that evidence in the expected common ground. Notice that does not appeal to any threshold rising mechanism, and yet it seems to give an explanation for why this kind of testimony is actually more demanding justificatorily than ordinary testimony. And then final point that I want to make is that the common ground plus model can account for discursivity without building it into the account of the standards for permissible intrascientific testimony, and that's because they can go right into part of the expected common ground. It's clearly going to be part of the expected common ground for any scientific testimony that scientific hypotheses are based on empirical evidence. Maybe they're based on empirical evidence plus there are other things. If you like simplicity and things like that as part of the grounds for advancing a scientific hypothesis. But the thought is that once you have something like that in there and scientists recognize this, then any scientist, and we also point out that we have, for example, our p-values that we're going to have in the expected common ground. So what kind of statistical significance you need to have. Then once you have those things in there and somebody tries to assert something in an attempt to get it as part of the common ground, a la the Stalnaker model, other scientists aren't going to merely accept it just to accept it. They may well query, well, what's the basis for that? That will mean that people will actually have to offer the basis for that. And since any speaker can anticipate all of this in advance, speakers will come to regularly expect of themselves that they offer their evidence. And you have discursivity phenomena without having to postulate discursivity as part of the norm of assertion, which I like because we can keep our norm of assertion simple. We can keep it the same for everything and get the features that Mikkel rightly notes in science out of this more general kind of strategy. So that's what I have to say. Here's my conclusion. Minimally, Stalnaker's inquiry is a potentially valuable resource for someone with Mikkel's interests. In addition, the enhanced common ground model offers the prospect of explaining many of the data he takes for granted. And then finally, and more provocatively, the enhanced common ground model may actually outperform Mikkel's model altogether. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sandy. Now, Mikkel has some time to respond to Sandy's comment. Please, Mikkel, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sandy. This was super interesting, and for a lot of it, I'm going to be somewhat tentative in accepting or rejecting what you said. You still hear me? It's Quinn. You can still hear me? That's good. Okay. So I talked about these sort of methodological integrations between philosophy of science and epistemology and philosophy and empirical work, right? And clearly another potential integration is between this issue in philosophy of science and work in linguistics and philosophy of language. And that's sort of the line that you are pursuing that I did not. So the book is not a treatise in the semantics of testimony or the nature of assertion or anything like that. So I've written it in a way to be sort of maximally neutral on the underlying framework, right? This is not because I have big objection to the Stalnaker. I was actually sort of brought up in a structured proposition. I'm a student of David Kaplan world, right? But I agree with you. There are lots, as a minimum, there's lots of resources to get from the Stalnaker's reflection on common ground and so on and so forth, right? But of course, that framework comes with a lot of baggage in linguistics and the metaphysics of propositions as sets of possible worlds and so on and so forth, right? That is stuff that I haven't addressed in the book and which has to be sort of the framework for assertion, right? Has to be independently assessed in terms of all the things that philosophers of language are into, Frege cases, how does it handle disquotation principle, quantifying in problems, the projection problems, a particular problem for the Stengenga framework, indirect speech reports, how does it deal with the pragmatic semantic interface, can it distinguish between conventional and conversational implicature, and all of these things, right? And this is not stuff I've done in the book, and stuff that would be required for an overall assessment of the common ground model, right? So we shouldn't try to do that here, right? So what I'll try to do is just sort of go through some of your main claims about it, note where I might have some reservations, and then turn to the applications to the phenomenon in interscientific testimony, and think about that, right? I think it's a super interesting application, so I sort of I'm very happy to see and excited to follow this strain of research, integrating work in philosophy of science and epistemology more with work in philosophy of language. But I'm not about to sort of take sort of very heavy stances on neither the Stengenga in particular or your sort of developments today. Yeah. I mean, so one thing just on the original notion of presupposition, right? And not the 70s notion, but the one that you cite from the paper after inquiry, right? I mean, and this is not me, this is sort of stock concern, right? Namely that it comes with this sort of higher order belief clause, like 2, in the notion that you presuppose something when you have a belief that it's assumed among all other conversational participants, right? So there's a real worry, obviously, of hyper-intellectualization here. Can kids presuppose anything, and so on and so forth, right? One thing that we want to keep clearly in mind is to distinguish between what Stengenga originally worked on, namely sentential presupposition and psychological presupposition on that can be attributed to the speaker, right? This actually brings me back to another lifetime. Like my first book, dealt a lot with psychological presupposition in the context of inference, but that's sort of an immediate concern, and one sort of additional concern to this, having to do with scientific collaboration, is that scientific collaboration is often pretty complicated, especially in sort of multidisciplinary scientific collaboration, where research is like taken from one discipline to the other without a lot of integration between them. So in those cases, it might be particularly hard for individual scientists to form beliefs about what's assumed by all the relevant collaborators, right? And in general, I think like the Stengenga framework really shines in it's sort of designed to in the first instance to deal with 2 people discussing whether they should buy bread on the way home from the baker, So there's some extension challenges, I think, to adapt it to something as complicated as multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary scientific collaboration. Yeah, you tweak on the expected common ground. Just sort of gut reaction, right? The 3 seems fine. I mean, I'm happy with that there's this sort of entitlement to presuppose cooperativeness. I can see the motivation for one, right? That the reasonability of presupposing something in a conversation involves sort of the reasonable assumptions that's shared with the people you talk. Otherwise, it's something you have to assert independently, right? Rather than presuppose in the conversation. I would think it would need a restriction, right? I'm worried that this holds in full generality, right? But and 2 definitely strikes me as too strong. And I also and consequently, I think that see is probably too strong, both in general, but particularly in scientific collaboration, right? So often, I mean, go to a conference, right? I mean, sometimes you presuppose something for the sake of the argument, even though you know it won't really convince the other ones to lay out your case, and then you hope that, you know, them getting the full theory will then make them realize that they should actually accept this presupposition you've been making all along. This is pretty common in scientific practice, and that's sort of not well captured by C, right? So I don't think this is reasons to abandon the common ground model or what have you.
Can hear you now.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. Yeah, so let me just take one step back, right? Yeah, so I think your key conclusion here, uh, I mean, there's something reasonable about it. I think it's a little too strong and would need some qualifications. I don't take this to be sort of devastating against order stalling or the common ground model or something like that, but it also sort of makes me hesitant to just sort of adopt it, right? All right. Yeah. So in particular, I thought, oh yeah, the claim about types, right? So this was about the expected common ground. The claim about types. I think it's reasonable to think that the relevant set of presuppositions can help type identify a conversation. I think it's too meager to be sufficient to type identify conversations, right? So I think I would be able to give you sort of twin cases where people have the same sets of presuppositions but are engaged in quite different conversations. Right? In one case, they might be joking or bonding or something like that. In other case, they might be exploring and they might have the same presuppositions. I think that can be done. So I'm a little skeptical about this sort of like I wouldn't accept like a supervenience claim, right? That once you settle the types of once you settle the sets of presupposition characterizing the conversation, then you also characterize the type of conversation. I think that's probably too just a first reaction, but I think that's probably too strong. And here I think it's super important to keep sentential. What is presupposed? What does a sentence presuppose versus what does a speaker presuppose? I think Stengenga is really good at keeping this apart early on in the 70s paper, but I think they sort of get merged maybe in later work, and it seemed to me to be a little, at least this, you know, in order for me to make firm verdicts here, I would have to think it through carefully and keeping these things very carefully apart, in particular, avoiding hyper-intellectualization worries for the psychological presupposition or the speaker presupposition. Yeah, and again, I mean, good science sometimes involves critical assessments of presuppositions of stuff that's in the common ground. So that sort of might be a bit of a challenge for the application to scientific collaboration and investigation, right? And so I just wanted to say, I mean, I can see how a lot of these assumptions are sort of figure in the quote, but sort of this. I don't think the quote you cited is much. It's a much more modest assumption that the pretty strong claims about the expected common ground or the sufficiency condition for type identifying conversations, right? So without wanting to take a stance, I don't think it's sort of a commitment of the book. I'm not quite ready to commit to this such strong thesis. I mean, I can see the motivation for them, right? But I would have to think much harder. And I raised some of the initial concerns that I would have to be relieved of in order to get on board, right? All right. So the upshot, as far as intrascientific testimony go, is that the model can deepen the explanation for some of the phenomena. Again, I would have to sort of see a little more in each case the spelled out argument from the two assumptions of the model to delivering these phenomena. In some of the cases, I could sort of see the basic idea in A to C. I think that's I mean that makes good sense, right? That the audience and the teleological functions of the testimony and who the audience is and what they can be expected to assume, that helps type identifying. You can expect that they will know a lot more about the relevant evidence if they are scientists, and that helps type identify the inter-scientific testimony as distinct from public scientific testimony. I can see that. I think that the common ground model is a nice sort of resource here. Yeah, we should talk more. I'm very interested in the pitfalls and the challenges having to do with disciplinary, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary research. A little worried here in this. It doesn't look, if I was developing a model of assertion, I wouldn't want it to by itself explain all that stuff, right? I mean, so I think that a lot of these explanations will have to, the challenges and the types of miscommunication will have to be, it's partly empirical, and I wouldn't expect sort of semantics of interscientific testimony just sort of to lay it all out for me, right? So if an account really does that, I would be a little bit suspicious. Here I think there's a much more sort of, here I think the integration with philosophy of science and a lot of studies of cases and empirical work is going to be really important to sort of get a good grasp. So I'd be much less a heuristics and be much less optimistic about how far you can get just from sort of linguistic considerations here. Yeah, little less sure that so I could see how it's compatible with the common ground model that epistemic testimony, scientific testimony, has a particularly demanding epistemic norm. But when you sort of laid out the how the motivation would go, it seemed to me that this was a case where the common ground model didn't do the explanation all by itself, that there were sort of auxiliary hypotheses that actually resembled the ones that I highlight in the book pretty much, right? So here I was at least less sure that the model alone would sort of provide the deeper explanation without some of the auxiliary hypotheses that I think are reasonable, but which I also argue for. So here I think we might be a bit closer than you suggested. Again, this idea that expert has an easier time. It was a little bit. When I read the slides, I had a hard time following that. But but in your oral presentation, I think I got the idea. And again, I think there's some contingencies here about the nature of expertise and the practices of scientific collaboration that are sort of empirical, pretty plausible, but not, but sort of require assumptions. And again, I would be a little bit suspicious if the model of inquiry and the semantics of assertion itself explain all that strikes me as sort of flirting with armchair hubris, So the advantages over my model, there's a sense in which we don't have two competing models, right? Because as I said initially, I'm not laying out a semantics of assertion, and I'm not committing to sort of a linguistic framework, right? But I guess your point is that having a model like that can provide some of the can vindicate some principles that I can't vindicate, or at least haven't done, or more, maybe more mildly, that I could only do in a more ad hoc manner, where the semantic framework would provide a more unified account. I guess that's part of the advantage. Yeah. But again, I'm not sure it's right to say that this Common Ground Plus model has advantages over my model, because the book is not really in the business of developing a semantic model of the nature of testimony, right? So my basis for setting forth the norms of intrascientific testimony, both the norms of giving it and the norms of uptake, is sort of twofold, right? It's reflection on sort of communicate requirements of truth conducive scientific collaboration, right? It's sort of it has the structure of a transcendental argument almost, right? It goes like, scientific collaboration and fine-grained division of cognitive labor turns out to have this amazing truth-conducive character. What are the distinguishing features that this type of communication and that type of collaboration must meet in order for it to have those epistemic features? That's sort of one line of argument that's the most aphoristic, I think. So that's pretty different from the sort of linguistic route. And the other one is sort of more a reflection on actual scientific practice, looking at aside some of the work of Susan Wagenknecht that's done qualitative research on scientific collaboration, that I think provides additive constraints on the norms. And I think, and then of course, as you pointed out, general, we'll talk a bit about that with Jacob later, but sort of it needs to fit the general norms of assertion that have been independently developed. So the approaches are pretty differences, right? Different, right? So one thing that you said, that you don't need postulate the threshold rising mechanism. It's just a function of the need to cohere materials in the expected common ground. And the idea, I take it, is that if you recognize that your interlocutor is another scientist that you collaborate with, you can expect them to assume much more of the relevant evidence, say, in the common ground, and that will by itself raise the bar. So one, again, not, I don't take this as a ground for dismissing anything, but sort of just an off-the-cuff concern. One worry is that the Common Ground Plus model can at best get something binary, right? So you get either your testimony coheres with the expected common ground or doesn't. So in order to get something where the epistemic threshold can actually vary depending on the particular context of the specific interlocution in case, and I think this is something that you like and you're committed to, right? I mean, I think you proposed a similar norm of assertion. So I think that some of the some auxiliary. So I'm worried that the CQ model will just get you either coherence or not, and that might elevate the threshold somewhat, but it won't get the sort of contextual variability that we both like. The discursivity thing, I mean, I want to think through it more, but I had a little harder time seeing how this idea that you were expected to be able to articulate relevant aspects of the underlying scientific came straight out of the model, right? So my basis for postulating this is much closer to looking at scientific practice and much less looking at sort of very general frameworks for for inquiry and the nature of assertion, right? It's just sort of looking at the at what collaboration demands, how communal belief revision works, and then I have some arguments that it works best if the relevant participants are able to articulate the justification for their claims, and then looking at actual scientific practice sort of indicates that this is indeed a norm. This is something you can, and scientists are criticized for if they don't meet it, right? So overall, super exciting to get to think about the more linguistic side of this. I think I agree there are lots of resources in the Stolnikarian framework. Uh, in some instances, I don't see how the framework alone provides all the good, but in some instances, I kind of think that's a good thing, right? Like I said, I think that if you completely detach these sort of heavily idealized linguistic frameworks and without looking at scientific practice and thinking epistemically about what truth-conducive collaboration demands, then I would sort of be worried actually if a framework such as the one you propose could explain all this sort of pretty fine-grained detail.
Great. We can now move on to the second commentator. Tai, please go ahead. The floor is yours, and please you can stop share screen. Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dario, for the chance to reflect further on this, and I hope to present something maybe a bit different than what Nico's heard me say before, but of use. So Gerken's ambitious and timely contribution aims to establish philosophical norms and guidelines for the nature of scientific testimony in democratic societies. Discussions in epistemology, philosophy of science, and science communication can greatly benefit from the attention and clarification this work provides on the topic. Moreover, the impact of this research extends beyond these fields, potentially influencing areas such as science education, which is of great interest to me. However, the author modestly restricts their focus to articulating norms, leaving the consideration of the implications and implementing their account of scientific testimony to those in a more informed position. Operating from a broadly realist standpoint, Gerken asserts that approximating truth is a legitimate and worthwhile goal of scientific theories. He focuses specifically on written and spoken forms of propositional scientific testimony that purport to convey a worldly fact. According to Gerken, scientific testimony has the capacity to assemble observational building blocks and is categorized by hallmarks of epistemic superiority, varying degrees of epistemic strength, and a foundation in discursive justification. Testimony meeting these criteria is not only pertinent to the workings of science, but an integral part of science itself. Gerken's focus lies on the fundamental phenomenon of testimony as an assertive speech act, defined as that P, which has conveying that P as its primary communicative function. However, it's important to note that Gerken's definition excludes non-propositional forms of testimony, such as gestures or pictures. It appears that Gerken's interest primarily centers on testimony that explicitly expresses propositions, facts, or beliefs. Nevertheless, he acknowledges that while verbal or written expressions are central examples of testimony, they are not exhaustive. He suggests that representational depictions, maps, or icons may count as types of testimony, including types of scientific testimony. Additionally, Gerken anticipates that the category of scientific reporting he offers is not a comprehensive overview, and that there are further subcategories, as well as hybrids and overlaps among the mapped categories. In this critique or response, I'll focus on Gerken's elucidation of public scientific testimony as a domain where such subcategories might be identified. The primary function of scientific experts in society is to offer epistemically authoritative testimony. In public scientific testimony, the lay public is the audience, and different types of testimony can be distinguished based on the testifier's access to scientific justification. The first type, expert scientific testimony, is provided by scientists possessing contributory expertise. These individuals can presumably provide and comprehend scientific justification. The second type, science reporting, is carried out by non-scientific experts like science journalists, who may possess interactional expertise but lack the contributory expertise of their expert counterparts. While they can discuss and transmit information about science, they are not expected to directly contribute to scientific endeavors. To explore other types of public scientific communication that may not fit neatly into these categories, I'll present two examples of science communication that I think illustrate the overlap and might even challenge conventional ascriptions of expertise. Both examples question the externalist notion of justification, and fortunately, Gerken acknowledges that an enormous variety of public scientific testimonies out there. So the following examples should be viewed as an invitation for further exploration and expansion. So thinking of expanding on the concept of science reporting beyond the scope of traditional science journalism, let's consider a broader range of science communicators. Science reporting involves non-experts or individuals without direct access to epistemic justification, communicating scientific testimony to lay audiences. In addition to science journalists, there are other science communicators who convey scientific testimony to the public. These sorts of communicators include museum docents, documentarians, social media science personalities, and others. While these individuals may not have formal training, they still play a crucial role in conveying scientific information to the public. Similar to science journals, these science communicators also fit the minimal background case where the recipient has minimal information about the testifier and the testifier's epistemically relevant properties, such as their competence, reliability, and sincerity. However, especially when the communicator develops a public persona, they might emphasize the epistemic relevant dimensions of their character. So for example, someone like Bill Nye the Science Guy, despite not being a practicing scientist, emphasizes his engineering degree as a way to establish his credibility in the realm of science communication. Considering the multitude of options available for science communicators, it's likely that the public exercises some degree of epistemic vigilance when selecting who to trust. If a communicator's testimony is grounded in scientific justification, then by being vigilant, the public is in a better epistemic position regarding the issue. Gerken's concept of appreciative deference, while not requiring epistemic vigilance, may provide little or no epistemic justification, although it may grant epistemic entitlement. However, while this approach might have been effective for science journalists historically, or evaluating science journalists and relying on science journalism historically, those science journalists were often associated with truth-vetting institutions like newspapers, and this is less true in the 21st century. There are now fewer science journalist positions at major newspapers, and those who do exist often have fewer resources at their disposal for their work. Furthermore, the rise of independent publishing on the internet challenges traditional journalistic norms. Therefore, epistemic vigilance is more crucial than ever. Like appreciative deference, epistemic vigilance necessitates taking violations of epistemic norms in public scientific testimony seriously. While it can be challenging to evaluate the credibility of communicators with platforms, I agree with Gerken that the epistemic well-being of the social environment is essential to prevent individuals from being overwhelmed. However, I ultimately advocate for including epistemic vigilance in the selection of communicators when adopting a differential attitude towards them. Effective science communication also relies on various means, such as demonstration, to engage publics. While testimony might not be wholly capable of providing perfect or complete understanding, combining it with techniques like demonstration or minor experimentation showing important aspects of science phenomena can contribute significantly to transferring knowledge to publics. Science communication's more recent turn towards establishing understanding and familiarity with scientific explanation rather than communicating true beliefs serves as an alternative theological aim for Hallmark 3 of discursive justification. If we consider demonstrations as a form of explanation, then science communication appears on par with some of the best scientific expert testimony. Further, scientific explanation approaches explicating scientific justification. And in response, Gerken writes, insofar as the scientific explanation is articulated in a way that the audience may appreciate, it may increase their understanding of why scientists regard the proposition in question as true or plausible. If we view science communication as intentionally crafted for audience comprehension, lay individuals may gain more than just testimonial entitlement to scientific hypotheses. They may also acquire some discursive justification for believing them. The degree of justification, of course, varies. A simple vacuum demonstration in which a feather and metal ball are shown to fall towards the Earth at the same acceleration is a far cry from explaining how the gravitational pull of black holes works. However, even if such a basic demonstration can in some sense offer justification for how attraction works, it's helpful. So what warrant, if any, does demonstrative science communication afford lay publics? Is it the act of witnessing demonstration or hearing the accompanying testimony that results in understanding? Does demonstration translate to lay publics being capable of articulating explanatory epistemic reasons? Furthermore, can demonstrations provide truth-conducive support for believing other propositions? Or is engaged contexts that help create fertile epistemic grounds to support robust epistemic environments possible? Finally, does this pose a challenge for the non-inheritance of scientific justification that Gerken supports? Under his account, the scientific justification that supports the speaker's testimony does not typically transfer in the sense that the recipient obtains the same type of degree of warrant that the testifier possesses. Here it is the scientist that possesses an epistemically internalist justification of for the content of her testimony and warrant that is robust against defeaters, whereas the layperson often only requires or acquires an epistemically externalist entitlement for his testimonial belief that may be defeated, for example, by a lack of consensus among his epistemic peers. However, demonstrations, including observation and sometimes participation, can provide access to justification in ways that are more traditional science reporting does not. So as demonstration is common in science communication, it merits considering whether these types of communication constitute different types of public scientific testimony. Here it might be tempting to say that it is the demonstration and not the testimony affording access in kind or degree to scientific justification. But without the accompanying testimony, the demonstration significantly risks being ineffective. Alternatively, if we take that S's demonstrative testimony does have some transmissive property, then this challenges hallmarks of public scientific testimony and the properties of scientific testimony more broadly. Science communication of this kind may be beyond a mere hybrid or borderline case and rather contain its own paradigmatic hallmarks pertaining to the interlocutor, audience, and access to discursive justification. And this requires Gerken's schema maybe to adapt accordingly. In societies pursuing deliberative democracy, important parts of science, such as data collection, are asymmetrically dependent on public scientific testimony. However, public participation in science is moving more towards recognizing a place for epistemic contributions to science by non-expert publics. Gerken points this out, mentioning citizen science projects, particularly in the environmental sciences, where publics actively partake in scientific processes, explaining that even public scientific testimony is far more closely interwoven with scientific practice than the science before testimony picture would have it. If, as the literature suggests, collaboration can improve both the scope and strength of justification of scientific research, then we might expect science communication that encourages public uptake of justification to be an asset to integrating lay publics in scientific collaborations. In other words, we can view science communication as playing a role in establishing the epistemic foundation for discursive progress, in line with Longino and Hackett's work. There are descriptions of science as truth-conducive and particularly their social structure. Science communication enables the expansion of scope and quality through hyper-specialization and incorporation of diverse perspectives and creative input that publics seem positioned to be a part of as well. Within the inner workings of science, proper basing being relatively minimal in the context of discovery might allow us to imagine non-experts being able to contribute, given that it is subject to less demanding epistemic norms. Discovery involves factors such as, again, creativity, intuition, chance, and recognition of personal biases, which transcend scientific experts and apply to all investigators, like active laypersons in participatory and citizen science projects. A reason to reject lay publics in this role might be that they might never be expected to contribute to the hyper-specialization of scientific collaboration that makes it epistemically superior and desirable in the first place. But part of what makes scientific justification epistemically superior to non-scientific types of warrant for knowing is the community of knowers whose justification must still be provided. Hence, science communication serves as an important primer for scientific collaboration with lay publics in that it builds the basis for public understanding of science to allow for contribution. Of course, in such collaborative contexts, there's the concern that the participation of publics in science might risk a contamination of science with, for instance, non-epistemic values. However, if individual interests don't apply to intra-scientific division of cognitive labor once a project is up and running, as Gerken says, then the threat of lay publics contaminating science should be minimized. Despite this, norms of scientific collaboration may in some contexts require scientists to accept intra-scientific testimony from someone they do not trust. The same could be said for a lay contributor, whereby science might trust their good intentions, but not be in an epistemic position to accept their intra-scientific testimony. In other words, even if H has propositional warrant for believing S's testimony based on adequate scientific justification, it does not require that H form the belief. A less harsh sanction for violating the norm for intra-scientific testimony uptake might occur, though. However, we might expect that under such circumstances, that sanctions for violations against non-experts would be different than those against experts, since we hold them to different epistemic standards. Beyond data collection, there are also more active ways for lay publics to consider and contribute to science using scientific testimony. In cases of citizen science, which Gerken recognizes, those whom we may generally consider lacking broad scientific justification can sometimes offer scientific testimony to experts. For example, Galaxy Zoo, a citizen science project that enlisted volunteers to classify galaxies in deep space images, found galaxy shapes like green peas that were unexpected to researchers. In this instance, collaboration between experts and lay experts generated additional warrant for that was co-created through the combination of truth-conducive cognitive competencies. Now, whether this type of testimony should be called public intra or interscientific testimony is unclear. It might even fall under the typology that Gerken provides because of the collaborative expertise publics can have in certain instances. But what's important here is that it really challenges folk epistemic or scientific notions of who experts are. And what's more important to recognize is the complexity it adds to the non-inheritance of scientific justification. If publics are actively participating in producing intra-scientific testimony, one might argue that their warrant might not need be epistemically externalized. The threshold degree of warrant varies in the context of science communication and noticeably so for the various types of science communication based on stakes, availability of evidence, urgency, and the opportunity for qualified assertions. This is not to say that all science communication offers the chance at internalist conditions for belief, and I certainly agree with Gerken that in many cases testimonial entitlement is an adequate epistemic position, but some types of scientific testimony seems to offer more of that appreciative deference simpliciter. In some, if lay publics are able to exercise enough faculty of reason to contribute new knowledge, develop scientific justification, and share this information with scientists, they should be accredited access to epistemic warrant for belief. I'll conclude quickly by saying that Gerken offers a helpful schema to appreciate the indispensability of scientific testimony in the pursuit of science and for science and society. I've proposed two dimensions in which Gerken's architecture might be tested. First, through the demonstrative capacity of science communication as an instance of public scientific testimony, and second, in the advent of citizen science and the epistemic contributions possible for citizen scientists in these collaborations. In both cases, the non-inheritance of scientific justification is challenged or at least requires further discussion.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. Now, Mikkel has some time to reply to Tai. Please, Mikkel, go ahead.
All right. Thanks a ton, Ty. This was extremely rich, and like you said, new. Like, I'm concerned, right? The Zoom we had in the fall of 22, I think, put me on a path to a 1.5 year project work on scientific recommendations, and now I'm worrying this will do the same, right? Because it's, I mean, I really like the way you take what's in the book, which, as you know, is pretty restricted to, you know, basic types of science reporting about factual stuff, and sort of use that as a stepping stone to other more complex and, in some cases, more interesting areas like citizen science and the role of demonstrations in conveying science to the public or engaging the public with science, right? So I'm hyper interested in all this stuff, and so it's nice to see sort of the overall project expand in these directions, right? So I'm not going to be able to address everything you say, but I'll try to focus on 3 things. The one issues where we may have a little bit of a discongruence and inclinations having to do with the epistemic vigilance by the recipients of testimony, and then the two areas that you mentioned, the role of demonstrations and the prospects for citizen science, right? First, I just want to I don't have anything to add to your recap. It was all sort of very precise. The only thing I wanted to say is, like, I fully accept. I mean, you cite me as saying that the primary function of scientific testimony is to offer epistemically authoritative testimony. I think that's the primary function for the types of scientific testimony that I restrict myself to. But I completely agree that there are other roles for sciences that fall under scientific testimony, and in particular the one I just mentioned about the role of science advisors in offering normative recommendations. That's a different speech act. I think it's also extremely important, right? So I'm in full agreement with that. Lots of unexplored territory here. So I want to agree with you that it's super important to, not just for taxonological research purposes, but also sort of to pursue new lines of research, to acknowledge the plentitude of roles, even if we restrict ourselves to science reporters or scientists who communicate to the public, that they have all these sort of various levels between, you know. You can sort of cast, okay, there's the epidemiologist who have like a projection about like how the pandemic will unfold, and then there's the science reporter who reports it. And I think it's really important to note that there's this sort of rich, hard to categorize plenitude of other roles that sort of counts as public scientific testimony. You mentioned museum docents and documentarians and social media science personalities. One thing I think a lot about is sort of the differing roles between scientific experts, which is what I focus on in the book, but something that I think is equally important, namely public intellectuals, who just sort of are not experts, but who raise awareness of scientific research on various issues and provide new perspectives and stuff like that. And even if we look at science journalists, I completely agree that they do more than just reporting hypotheses, which is what the book sort of restricts itself to, right? And I also think it's an astute point that given that the reality of science communications that laypersons face is not restricted to scientific experts and science reporter who just sort of reports onwards, that generates a sort of an important cognitive task for the layperson, an identification problem, if you will, for allocating trust and deference to the many people who to the many people who offer scientific testimony, in some cases pseudoscientific testimony. So some of my work on the epistemic trespassing is dedicated to this, but I think the focus on sort of the less neat categories, like the museum custodian, the public intellectual, is extremely important, right? So you sort of highlight the importance of individual vigilance on part of the recipients, right? And you do know that we're not in huge disagreement here, right? So you do know that we're in broad agreement that the social environment is essential, but you want to push more the role or the importance of people taking responsibility, being more epistemically vigilant, educating themselves on the natures of expertise, and allocating deference in a perhaps more fine-grained manner than people do. And so I'm not disagreeing that that's important. I certainly think that, science education should be tailored much more to allow people to exercise these types of epistemic vigilance, but also think it's extremely important to respect sort of the psychological and the cognitive bounds of laypersons, right? So, I mean, given and this is part of the new information environment, is that there's so much information, there's so many candidates for offering scientific testimony, that I think it's if we think about the cognitive bounds and what sort of feasibility constraints, then I think we have to face that lay persons will rely on pretty brute heuristics for in terms of allocating trustful behavior. And I think these are often very deeply seated in our cognitive architecture, and given the changes of the informational environment that you rightly highlight, I think that sometimes these sort of deep-seated cognitive heuristics are not ecologically valid. They're ill-fitted, so to speak, to the messy informational reality that we face, right? So I'm completely in favor of promoting something like science literacy, and I think that the most recent empirical research on science literacy does indicate that it helps people, for instance, in helping them adjusting their credence in the light of scientists communicating uncertainty. But I guess where we might differ is I'm more optimistic about sort of social level intervention that are based on empirical research about the types of cues of scientific expertise that we know that empirically that laypersons actually rely on, right? So I think what the perhaps most promising way forward for me is to think about, okay, what socio-psychologically viable cues would that have high Q validity, right? I mean, where it is such that if the Q is registered, then there's a high chance that if there's a Q of a scientific expert, then there's a high chance that the testifier is a scientific expert. What sort of cues do people actually rely on, and then sort of try to highlight those in our science communication, right? So that's why one reason why I'm so interested in science communication strategies, and so maybe there's a bit of a disagreement between us here, right? So I'm promoting this. I call it I mean, one of the things I'm interested in the final chapters of the book is how to allocate the normative demands. What need the producers, the people who give scientific testimony to the public, do? What can we expect reasonably of the recipients, and what should we do as a society to have the right informational environment and cues of expertise with high Q validity? And I have this sort of pyramid structure where I think the bulk is the base of that has to be societal intervention, structural obligations that we should enforce as a society. Then there's pretty strong norms for scientific testifiers that they need to meet, including the epistemic norms as set forth, and then fairly minimal normative obligations on part of the recipients. And I guess part of what you do, it's not like you're inversing the pyramid, but you want to have more of a block-shaped division of normative labor or something like that. I don't know whether that's fair, right? But a lot of this will come down to the actual work, and I think your remarks on citizen science and demonstrations are sort of important examples of this. So I'll move on to that, right? So yeah, so demonstrations of scientific facts or the relevant scientific justification or what have you. I mean, it's not something I discussed in the book, but I want to sort of wholeheartedly agree with your claim that it can be not just sort of instrumental in increasing trust, but it can actually deepen understanding and generate another kind of a higher level of appreciation for the scientific justification underlying the hypothesis, right? And I think that aligns pretty well. This is at least what I want to, although I don't address this mode of science communication or science involvement in the book, but I think it aligns very neatly with sort of my preferred science communication strategy of communicating the strength of nature of scientific communication. In effect, I think demonstration is one mode of doing that, right? So in that sense, I think the framework pushed in the book is very congenial to recommending demonstration being used in science communication whenever it's feasible. And I agree with your points about the benefits of people not just getting sort of brute entitlement that you can trust this, but actually getting to be able to articulate some of the justification on the basis of demonstrative science communication. So I'm here we're just in maybe more alignment than your presentation suggested. There's of course one thing that sort of rears its ugly head, and that's sort of feasibility, right? You know, I mean, it's a resourceful mode of science communication to use demonstrations, and that's a limitation. But actually, there is in the science of science communication, there's a huge focus now on using illustrations and memes and things like that have a demonstrative character. So I think there's sort of ample room for. I don't think we should be too scared about the feasibility constraint. I think there's ample room for exploring demonstrative modes of science communication, which I think fall in line with the emphasis on scientific justification that I like. So you asked whether it poses a challenge on non-inheritance of scientific justification. So the non-inheritance is that's just the idea that testimony. That you can be warranted on the basis of testimony without getting the same type of warrant that the testifier has, right? So that's just sort of a negative principle. So if I tell you that my cherry tree is no longer blooming, but my apple tree is, you have some warrant for believing that my cherry tree is no longer blooming, but you don't have the same warrant I have, right? I have perceptual warrant, you don't, right? So that's just that basic principle, right? But and that stands. I mean, that the fact that scientific testimony in some cases can produce better or finer or deeper types of epistemic warrants than the mere entitlement, that's compatible with the principle that it doesn't do by default, So I think so it's consistent with non-inheritance principles that the efforts of the sort that you're interested in, for instance, demonstrations, are required to get more than sort of brute externalist entitlement to get more intellistic type of justification. And I mean, I agree with you that that's desirable, right? So I think this is something that we should pursue, so I kind of think that the principle here actually lends weight to your research program, right? Because the principle says that, okay, justification, understanding, or ability to explain, you don't get that for free. It takes a communicative effort to get it. And what you point out is that demonstrations is one way of getting to communicate something much richer than communicating in sort of bare minimalistic testimony, right? And that's worth pursuing, and all of that I think we agree about. Again, I would highlight that I think the key is sort of empirically grounded assumptions about what types of articulation, what types of demonstrations, what types of metaphors, what types of narratives actually do succeed in transmitting some degree of scientific justification to laypersons. And there's some interesting empirical work on that. But as far as the research program goes, I think we're in. I want to march on the Branchian banner and the Branchian. You can pick your. Let me say a few things about citizen science, right? So you say science communication serves as an important primer for scientific cooperation with lay publics, that it builds the basis for public understanding of science to allow public contribution, right? And yeah, no objections here. I think that's exactly right. And actually, one of the cases I give late in the book where I argue for the sort of the centrality of science and how it's not so easy to distinguish between intrascientific and public scientific science, or science communication as a part of science or as a product of science is exactly citizen science, right? In those cases, you need to communicate something to people in order to enable them to contribute, right? So again, I think we're closely on a par here. Like you, so you say that of course this raises a risk of non-epistemic values. That's negligible. I think I mostly agree with that. I'm actually not super worried about in this context of citizen science about non-cognitive value contamination. Some exceptions might be consensus conferences, because those tend to be framed by people with enormous economical incentives. Namely, I mean, those are mainly popular in the biomedical fields, and that's in part because it serves the biomedical industry. And here we might want to have clear principles for how non-cognitive value should be managed in collaborative citizen science-y endeavors. But otherwise, I share your lack of concern here. Yeah, I think so. You point out that the norms of interscientific testimony will differ depending whether you have an expert or layperson collaborating on a scientific project, and I think this is something that the principle can accommodate, right? So some of the parameters that sets the epistemic threshold for when you can testify something when you're collaborating will allow that the role and the expectations of the speaker here can raise or lower the standards, right? So I think that's fairly congenial to the norm I propose. So one thing you say is that that's sort of the communication within citizen size might fall under the typology I provide. And in part because it can challenge folk scientific notions of who the experts are. So that becomes less clear. I take it that's the point if the laypersons are involved in the research, right? So yeah, so I'm actually my first thought here is actually that that the types of communication between experts and laypersons in citizen science stuff does not sort of neatly fall under one of the categories. I think the taxonomy I provide is probably too coarse-grained, and it's not. Yeah, it does. I think it might need its own category. We talked about the taxonomical issues before, and you know, I think this is a good. I think this is a good case where we might want to branch out the the taxonomy a little bit, right? On the other hand, I want to be I want to hold on to the definition of at least epistemic expertise, right, as something that has epistemic criteria, not sociological criteria. And one of the upshots and benefits of citizen science that you highlight rightly, I think, and I think there's good reasons for excitement about this, is that the level of but the type of epistemic warrant that it can convey to laypersons, not just the people engaged in the citizen science, but also the people then who you know hear from it, may well be more internalist in the sense that people have better access to the justifying features, are better able to articulate them. I think that's right. That's the big prize, one of the big prizes of citizen science, right? We don't want to think about it just instrumentally as increasing trust in science or having acceptance of scientists or being willing to fund science or something like that. I also think I agree with you that there's a sort of tangible epistemic benefit, right? But again, I mean, I do a little bit of the I have a little bit of sort of citizen science efforts that I'm engaged in, and when you try to do it, as you know well, you really do face sort of feasibility constraints, right? So we do want to ask the question that investors asks promising startups, right? Is it scalable, right? I mean, because a lot of this is very resource heavy, and we want to find out what the benefits are, also, so we don't leave it to the people with the most resources and for it, right? So, but again, I don't think we have principal disagreement here. And then the final thing I think was inspiring about your presentation is that I agree that once we look at these other more sophisticated or more complex types of scientific testimony, where it's integrated much more in research, it raises some interesting novel questions, right? You raise a few, right? So when should scientists, if ever, show appreciative deference to lay publics, right? I mean, I strongly agree with you that they often should, right? My favorite case is probably a field like psychiatry, right? So where psychiatrists have medical taxonomies that are used diagnostically, and psychiatric patients have lived experiences that they articulate in very different vocabulary, where it doesn't fit neatly, and you want to take their perspective very seriously, right? So I mean, if somebody uses a phrase like describes a condition as lethargic, right? You really want to make sure that you get where they are coming from and try without sort of imposing a diagnostic, the way it's used in diagnostics on that expression, right? And that's just one case. I think sort of all social and human sciences that deals with the environments and lived conditions of its subjects, the appreciative difference is a two-way street, right? Yeah, then there's these issues about belief. It's going to come up a little bit in Jacob's contribution as well. I mean, so I think this is sort of an important an important issue that's, for instance, is super important for climate science communications, right? I mean, often scientists will communicate, and my norms allow them to communicate on the basis of not belief but acceptance, and laypersons may have a hard time with that distinctions. It might be very hard for people to get that, you know, you can accept something that you don't believe, and so I think I just want to recognize that those are sort of key questions for if you want to have, if you want to pursue this ideal of a deliberative democracy where there's this interface between scientific institutions and public discourse, right? That these are not distinctions that we should assume that laypersons are down with, you know. Yeah, there's much more to talk about. I hope we'll get a chance to talk more. But thanks a ton. This was super rich and like sort of downright inspiring.
Great. So now we can move on to the final commentator. Jacob, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay? Great. Okay, so thanks Dario for organizing this, and thanks Miguel for writing such a good book. So I'll just start by saying commenting on this book is in some sense really easy because this book is so nicely written, extremely well organized, clearly signposted. The individual chapters are nicely integrated into a coherent whole, defending what I take to be the main thesis, which I find completely compelling, namely that a norm of scientific testimony should be based on justification. And the book itself is grounded in an immense amount of contemporary literature, both in epistemology and philosophy of science. And one achievement of the book, and one thing that I think is really important, is, you know, one of Mikhail's many ambitions here is to bridge those two disciplines, epistemology and philosophy of science. And such bridging I find really important. There's not enough of it. So I really like the book, but precisely because I like the book, and I find the main thesis convincing, commenting on it is not so easy. So I had to kind of reach really deep to find some points of disagreement. I'm going to flag two of those points in this commentary. But first, though, I'll just say that what I take to be Mikhail's main thesis is a defense of the importance of justification for scientific testimony, and I think that is exactly right. So I've just finished writing a book in which I also place justification at the center of an epistemology of science. And Mikhail's book itself was a valuable resource and inspiration for the writing of my book. So his book has already been helping me for more than 1 year. And I'll also say that, you know, this book is in some sense the most recent installment in an ongoing research program. So, you know, Mikhail has been contributing to the epistemology of science and epistemology broadly construed for a long time. He's been resisting this so-called knowledge first program, which has been so popular in epistemology for, you know, 25 years or so. And so, although I'm not a board certified epistemologist, I do find Mikhail's overall research program, the kind of response and criticism of the knowledge first program to be sensible and compelling. And that kind of main theme from his research program over the years appears here in this book. Okay, so now the 2 points of 2 points of disagreement, and these points arise throughout the book, but I'm going to focus on chapters 3 and 4, and I take those 2 chapters to be the kind of, you know, jugular veins of the book. So I'm really going for the jugular here in some sense, but in another sense, I don't actually think that the 2 points of disagreement that I'm raising are in fact that crucial or central to Mikhail's overall project in the book. And so I think his central achievements stand despite these points of dispute. So really what I'm about to say, we can understand as kind of quibble. All right, so first point, this is about whether or not we should be philosophical lumpers or splitters about the notion of testimony or scientific testimony. So Mikhail seems to have the philosophical instinct of a splitter. So he distinguishes between various kinds of assertion or testimony. Like one of those kinds is scientific testimony, and then that itself gets further distinguished by Mikhail into intra-scientific testimony, inter-scientific testimony, and then sort of public-facing science reporting. And my own philosophical instinct, at least in this particular domain, when we're asking questions about the norms for testimony, my own instinct is to be a lumper. So it's hard for me to see why there would be different norms for testimony or scientific testimony in different communicative contexts. And indeed, I think Mikhail's own work over the years, not necessarily just in this book, but more broadly, has been to argue for a justification norm of assertion in general contexts, where what justification demands varies according to context. Given that Mikhail already has this kind of context-sensitive, justification-centered account of assertion or testimony, it seems plausible to me that we could take that and apply it to scientific testimony. So a lumper about testimony will doubt one of Mikhail's claims in the book, and this thesis appears in a few places. So Mikhail calls this distinctive norms. So this is a thesis which holds that norms of intrascientific testimony, quote, go beyond generic normative requirements that apply to all types of testimony, end quote. That's page 41. So which requirements then are supposed to apply to scientific testimony and which do not also apply to testimony in general? So presumably those requirements are the ones that are articulated in the main norm Mikhail articulates for intrascientific testimony. He calls this NIST, N-I-S-T, the norm for intrascientific testimony. Okay, so that norm holds that scientific testimony must be, quote, properly based on a degree of scientific justification. That's page 109. So what appears to be doing the splitting work for Mikhail is the notion of scientific justification. Okay, so we can ask, what's that? And Mikhail doesn't really say exactly, but in chapter 3, so we're kind of rewinding now, going from chapter 4 to chapter 3, he notes a few hallmarks of scientific justification. There are 3. So these hallmarks are, first, hallmark 1, in many domains, scientific justification is generally epistemically superior to non-epistemic types of warrant. Hallmark 2, scientific justification generally comes in degrees of epistemic strength. And hallmark 3, scientific justification generally involves a high degree of discursive justification. It's on page 101. Okay, so now I agree that these are, in some sense, hallmarks of scientific justification, but I doubt that they do much to distinguish scientific justification from justificatory practices in general. So start by noting that in any domain, scientific or otherwise, epistemic justification comes in degrees, and that I think is something that Mikhail himself has argued for in previous work. And so from that, it follows that there can be superior and inferior epistemic justifications for assertions, scientific or otherwise. So hallmark 1 and 2 appear to apply to all domains. And notice also that one might generally doubt hallmark 1. So it's not plausible to suppose that the latest estimate of Hubble's constant, for example, is better justified than my assertion that there's now beer in my fridge. So what Mikhail must mean by hallmark 1 is that for some particular claim in some particular domain, scientific justification is generally epistemically superior to non-epistemic types of warrant for that claim. But I'm not sure what a scientific justification for the claim that there is now beer in my fridge would look like. So while I agree that scientific justification is epistemically impressive very often, it's not so obvious to me that it's superior than, for example, me just observing that there's a cup of tea on my desk now. So that's hallmark 1 and 2. Now I'm going to turn to hallmark 3, and this is going to be a bit of a rabbit hole, so I'm going to dive deep. So hallmark 3 is scientific justification generally involves a high degree of discursive justification. So I think that's correct. I think that's right. But when we reflect on common linguistic practices, I think that assertion in general, testimony in general, is routinely held to a standard of discursive justification. And so scientific testimony is no different than routine testimony in that respect. So I'm going to dwell on this. So if we think about common communicative responses to testimony or assertion, I think that that reveals that we hold ourselves to a discursive standard. So for example, if Mikhail makes some assertion, I might ask him, well, why do you think so? So he claims that such and such basketball team is going to win the championship next year. I might ask him, why do you think so? That's a common response. And that's, there's a wide range of communicative responses in English, right? But we can also think about other examples to just sort of pump our intuitions here. So a common Ukrainian way of responding to an assertion is "Звідки ти це знаєш," which is translated as basically "from where do you know that?" Звідки is from where. So, this request from where is indicating that the recipient of testimony is asking about the speaker's justification, reasons for the claim. Here's another one. "Де ти таке почув?" It's also Ukrainian, which asks, where did you hear that? Like a common kind of response. Or here's German. Warum denkst du das? Why do you think that? And, one can go on. One could just take a bunch of examples from basically any language. And these examples, I think, suggest that that we routinely are holding ourselves to not just a standard of justification, but a standard of discursive justification. Less familiar to speakers of Indo-European languages is this grammatical feature of some languages, which is called evidentiality. So of the 7,000 languages, roughly 7,000 languages in the world, about 25% of languages are evidential languages. So an evidential language is one that builds into the very grammatical structure of assertions features that convey the kind of information that justifies the assertion. So, and sentences in these languages which don't have those grammatical features are just deemed ungrammatical by speakers. Evidentiality is common in indigenous languages in North and South America. And I'll just give you one example. So there's this language, Tariana. It's an indigenous language of Brazil. In Tariana, a speaker has got to grammatically mark one's information source. So you can't just say Jose played football. That's like a gross grammatical error. But you can say Jose irida di manica ka. So that ka suffix says we saw it. So that says Jose played football, we saw it. Or you could say Jose irida di manica maca. Jose played football, we heard it. Or Jose irida di manica nica. Jose played football, we inferred it from visual evidence. Okay, so this is just one example. So we see both in non-evidential languages like English or Ukrainian, there's an extremely rich kind of substantive range of ways to articulate the source and degree of justification. And in evidential languages, they just build the source of justification of assertion or testimony into the very grammar of language itself. I find all of this highly suggestive. I think that this kind of rich variety of ways to mark both uncertainty and source of information can be conveyed, the fact that it can be conveyed both lexically and grammatically suggests that assertion is governed by a justification norm and not a knowledge norm. And so that supports Mikhail's kind of, big picture general project. But it also suggests that non-scientific testimony is routinely, involving a high degree of discursive justification. And so I think that casts doubt on Mikhail's hallmark 3 as a distinctive feature of scientific testimony. Okay, so that was a real rabbit hole. We could climb out of the rabbit hole. Where are we? I doubt that those 3 hallmarks that Mikhail is highlighting does much to distinguish scientific justification from justification in general as a kind of, different species, which is not to say that scientific justification isn't great or awesome or special. I think it is. Scientific justification has this extreme degree of rigor, systematicity. It frequently relies on sophisticated machinery, formalisms, but that doesn't make it distinctive in kind from justification in general. So I think that thesis, distinctive norms thesis, is false. Whatever norm we end up defending for assertion in general will apply to science, scientific testimony, and vice versa. So I think distinctive norms is false, but I'm also not sure why it matters too much, because I think that Mikhail's overall project stands regardless of distinctive norms. Okay, so that was point one of dispute. Here's the second point of dispute. And this is a point that's been raised by the previous commentators. So the question is, what norms should govern uptake of intra-scientific testimony? Now, a norm on uptake is really important, right? We don't want well-justified scientific testimony to just be ignored, particularly in collaborative scientific contexts. So Mikhail, in the latter half of chapter 4, offers a particular norm of uptake of scientific testimony, which strikes me as one of a range of possible options, but it also strikes me as an option which is not as compelling as other possible options. Okay, so Mikhail's norm, he calls NISU, N-I-S-U, a norm of intra-scientific uptake. And Mikhail is an analytic epistemologist. He likes his S knows that P if and only if stuff. So if we strip away this S knows that P kind of glitter and shine, no, the NISU norm basically says a scientist who receives testimony which is based on scientific justification should believe or accept that testimony. No, I'm not so sure. So one worry here is that if we put a Bayesian hat on, we might wonder about cases in which the recipient of the testimony has a low prior probability in the claim being asserted. So if I have a low prior in X and Mikhail asserts X and Mikhail, articulates proper scientific justification for X, then plausibly my credence in X should go up. But should I believe or accept X? I don't see why, because my posterior credence in X might still be below some reasonable threshold for belief or acceptance. And another worry is like that assertion X might really conflict with some of my deeply held commitments, in which case it's also hard for me to see why I should be bound to believe or accept the assertion. So I might have to modify my deeply held commitments. And suppose I did have some, pre-established, pre-existing credence in the testimony in X, I might, a plausible norm might be that I should modulate my credence in X, but a norm might look something more like, Quine's conservative principle of minimal mutilation rather than Mikhail's principle. We don't, that's just one of many options, but Mikhail's principle looks kind of sort of radical in the sense that we're supposed to believe or accept X. Quine's minimal mutilation might be on the sort of other end of the extreme, and the Bayesian might be sort of somewhere in the middle. So plausibly there's a range of plausible options on a norm of uptake. I'm not sure that I want to buy the one that is on offer in chapter 4. I think I might be more sort of inclined to a kind of Bayesian norm of uptake. In any case, okay, so those are the 2 points of dispute. Wrapping up, as I started with, this is really an excellent book. It's already had a huge impact on my own work, and I raised 2 little quibbles. Those quibbles aside, I believe this book will be helpful to many scholars interested in scientific testimony, science communication, and of course, the epistemology of science. So thanks, Mikhail, for writing this great book.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jacob. Now, Mikhail, please go ahead and feel free to give your response to Jacob.
You can see the slides. Yeah, thanks a lot, Jacob. In-house dispute are always the hardest ones, right? The fiercest ones, they say. Because your criticism really comes from the core of assumptions that we share, right? So I just want to sort of highlight some of the sort of broad agreements that sort of underlines, for the purpose of people who are not us, these points of criticism you raised, right? So sort of a positive thing is sort of the importance of epistemic warrants, and indeed sort of the relevance of internalist types of warrant, what I call justification, discursive justification in science in particular. you might be a little happier with that in general, whereas I think it's more distinctive to science, right? But that's nevertheless sort of a broad agreement, and sort of a negative corollary of that, and I'm not going to talk about today, is we are sort of in full agreement about the deficiencies of the sort of knowledge first approaches in general, and perhaps in particular as applied to the philosophy of science, right? And a lot of what you say is grist on that mill. And also I think we have like an overarching sort of methodological approach in common, which is sort of focusing on the relevance of norms in accounting for scientific practice, and indeed in accounting for why scientific practice is sort of epistemically has the epistemic characteristics that it does. So that is sort of a pretty broad common base in terms of methodology and also substantive assumptions, right? So the first point of criticism is to argue that I'm going to respond to the sort of thing about the hallmarks first, and then I'm going to say a bit about the splitter lumber methodology at the end, right? So your sort of the first point is that. So I say that this distinctive norm, right, that there's some distinctive features of interscientific testimony that should be captured in a norm thereof, that distinguishes it from the genus from which it's a species, namely my general norm of assertion, right? And you think basically that's the same norm, right? Because what I appeal to is why I say is that interscientific justification is characteristic in that it has to be based on scientific justification, and then you look at the characterization of scientific justification. Of course, that's a big fish, right? But what you point out is that, or what you argue is that the hallmarks of it, I set forth as a preliminary characterization, they don't do the distinguishing jobs, right? And for some of them, I want to grant it, and for some of them, I want to argue that they do a little more distinguishing work than what you suggest, and then I'm going to return to the splitter lumber thing on that basis, right? So for hallmark 2, the idea that Sandy pointed this out also, right, that gradability is not distinguished. It doesn't do any distinguishing work, right? Virtually all, maybe cogito thoughts or something like that are exceptions, right? But other than that, basically all empirical warrant at least is gradable, so scientific, no distinguishing work. That I want to grant, right? And I think I hope I haven't had time to look it up, but as I remember, I try to be explicit about that in setting forth that hallmark, that this is just a common background assumption. I do rely on it, so I did want to sort of include it, right? Because I rely heavily on it in setting forth, of course, a gradable, a sliding threshold norm, right? So I think it might be helpful. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. As you point out, there's some epistemological glitter here, right? In terms of trying to get it precise, but so the way I tend to write and also do in the book is I give the sort of official formulation with all the qualification, and then I give a nutshell formulation afterwards, much like what you did, right? So the nutshell formulations of Vasa, which is the general norm, the warrant account of assertion, right? It's just that the conversational context determines so all assertions require that you have some warrant for what you assert, and the context in which you assert it determines how strong that warrant needs to be, and also what type it needs to be, I think, right? And NIST, the specific norm for interscientific testimony, I take to be a species of the overarching one, where in general there's a type constraint, right? That it's not enough to base interscientific testimony on, for instance, entitlement, you have to base it on scientific justification, and I think the discursiveness of just scientific justification is key. So I want to think a little bit about what you say about that, right? But that's so I take that to be a genus-species relation between them, and I'm going to come back to that when we talk about the lumping splitting bit, right? So the superiority bit, I do think, plays some distinguishing role when you think of it in a genus-species kind of way, right? So you give this case of, so you can easily find cases, and you give one in which the scientific justification for one hypothesis, Hobbes constant, or the R0 for a virus, or what have you, is worse than mundane warrant for another hypothesis, that there's beer in your fridge, or that I have toenails, or what have you, right? So you suggest that the idea is it's not absolute, right? Because you can just find cases in which ordinary warrant is stronger than scientific warrant, right? So I agree with that, and that's sort of part of the story, that it's sort of intrinsically comparative, and you want to hold the hypothesis fixed, right? So you can't. So if you had some intuitive warrant for Hobbes constant, right, that would be, in general, in very few exceptions, it would be lower than the scientific warrant for Hobbes constant. And the same even goes for the beer in the fridge. Of course, we typically don't have scientific justification for that, but it would actually beat the ordinary stuff. You could make a chemical analysis of the liquids in your fridge and confirm that they're beer, and that would elevate the strength, right? So that does some of the work, I think, characterizing NIST. Once you hold the hypothesis fixed, right, that it's one of in requiring scientific justification, you do require the sort of strongest type of justification available, right? So if I'm collaborating with a marine biologist, and I've had a swim at the outer reefs, Great Barrier Reefs, and I think there's extensive bleaching, and I think it's due to a combination of El Nino and global warming, right? This is just sort of a layperson's sort of informed intuitions based on a swim, right? I can't assert that in collaborating with other sciences, because there's relevant scientific justification that's better, right? And so given that NIST requires the latter, I think that is sort of a distinction feature, right? So I think it does, it might not do as much work as you would want, but I think it does some distinguishing work, yeah. I also just think that the sort of the absolute standards for scientific justification tends to be higher, right? So you can find, and in my previous book, I developed some cases like where the cost of gathering evidence is higher than acting on a false assumption, right? In those cases, you can assert something on the basis of very bad warrant in ordinary discourse, right? I mean, so my case is like, if I say the game is on, right? Acting on that assumption, turning on, will have very little consequences, and actually getting further evidence, will be more costly than acting on the false assumption. So I don't need to have much warrant to assert the game is on in ordinary context. But that doesn't fly in interscientific communication, right? At least you would have, even if the stakes are low, when you do scientific collaboration, you would have to qualify that this is an intuition, or this is what I recall, or whatever, right? So in that case, I do think that the superiority thing does some of the work distinguishing NIST as a species, that comes with sort of generally different standards than WESA, right? And I want to say the same thing about the discursive justification, right? So you cite this impressive array of cross-linguistic work on prompting to motivate something that I think we agree about, that discursive context. This is just my phrase for conversational context in which discursive justification is required, the ability to defend the claim is required, are ubiquitous, right? Or even if it's not a discursive context, you can generate it by prompting, right? So I think that is right. And maybe evidential languages are always this minimalist discursive context, right? I do want to suggest that I'm not a specialist in this, but at least from what I know, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the main characteristic of evidentials is that syntactic grammaticality requires source indication. That seems to be sort of the thing that you note the source of the I think that falls sort of short of being able to articulate the warrant as an epistemic reason, just sort of indicating source kind of falls short of that. And also I think you can find something that's very hard to find in interscientific collaboration. You can't find it, but I think it's much harder. I think you can find, even in the evidential language, excessive probing, right? I mean, it'll be inappropriate if you just keep going on to the point of skepticism, even in a evidential language. And of course, it can also, we've known this since Kuhn, of course, it can also be inappropriate in scientific context. You need some common assumptions that you know questions to do work, but it's much more acceptable to continue prompting in scientific context, right? And remember that Hallmark 3 says that it's generally a high degree, right? So that's so I do think there's some distinguishing work being done here. And also, I think you can find something in ordinary context that's very hard to find in interscientific context, right? So we talk about traveling Central America. I say that Tegucigalpa is the capital of Honduras. I can't provide any reasons. I just can't provide any reason. It's a typical case of what's called source amnesia. You learn something, you forget the source, you remember what you learned. And if you ask me how I know, or whether I'm sure that it's not the capital of Nicaragua, I have nothing to say in its defense. But as a matter of fact, I am warranted. And if the case is not a high stakes case, it's perfectly fine. Again, I think that you can't do that in science. You can't just make assertions without having anything to say about the source. So I think that's a sort of, I mean, even so, granting that the discursive contexts are ubiquitous, there's some limits to them in ordinary discourse that you don't find in interscientific discourse. Probing, excessive probing, is much quicker reached. And it's very hard to find something in interscientific testimony that you do find in ordinary cases, namely cases where you only have entitlement, right? And that seems fine. So I do think the hallmarks do some distinguishing, at least enough to what I want to say. You do have something like mere source indication in multi. This is work that couldn't fit in the book. It's now a paper on trespassing that's out in it's out in Mind, and I argue that actually trespassing is often okay, and effective collaboration requires it. And in those cases, you can sort of get away with just indicating sources, right? So you just say something like, I don't know why you think it's that old, but that's what the paleontologists say, right? But it sort of provides a method for reaching the discursive justification that you can then pursue if needed. So I don't think that's sort of in tension with the requirement of scientific justification, but I mean, it's sort of an interesting case and one that I could have flagged a little more in the book, but now I hope the paper will remedy the situation a little bit. All right. Oh yeah. So where does that leave us with the sort of, I mean, I think it's interesting to think about these things and then sort of go back to the overarching methodology, right? And you draw this distinction between splitters and lawnmowers and say that I'm a splitter, right? And maybe this proves your point, right? But I kind of think that these distinctions are too crude, right? So I guess that's like I'm a splitter squared now, right? But what I want to highlight is what I flagged early on is the way I think of it is is to think of course, you don't want to say that it's a completely different norm. I mean, I define testimony as an assertive speak acts, right? So it would be very strange, extremely ad hoc and problematic if it wasn't embedded in the general framework for norms of assertion generally, right? So that's why I think of it as a and that's why I wanted to have the complicated formulations on the slide also, right? I think of it as a genus that's subsumable under the species of a general norm of assertion. So I don't really think the splitter lumber category catches that approach, because what I get and what I like and what I kind of think is a selling point for NIST is that you get the structural unification, right? You get context determines type and strength of scientific justification, and then you get some standard key differences between ordinary circumstances, requires the strongest justifications around, and requires a much higher degree of discursiveness than the ordinary case. So you get structural unification and output diversification out of the framework, and I think that sort of it puts me in both categories. Alarm structurally a split in terms of the actual requirements, right? So and I like that, you know. Okay, uptake. Yeah, here I also just want to put the big ugly formulation on the thing with the epistemological glitter, because in this case, I'm actually trying to argue that the epistemological glitter is gold, right? That once you have the qualifications included that the nutshell formulations omits, then your problems are dealt with, right? So here's the glitterless reformulation. A scientist who receives testimony based on scientific justification would believe or accept that testimony, right? So one thing that's left out in the nutshell formulation is that the hearer must have some meta warrant for that S is providing into scientific testimony, right? I mean, if you have no idea that the person is a scientist, then even though the person is a scientist, then you don't, the uptake norm doesn't apply, right? So in work I'm doing actually with Dario at the moment, we think about case where you run into like an economist who's like an expert on bubbles on the train, but you don't have no idea that she is, and then she'll say something like the medtech bubble will burst, right? In this case, you shouldn't believe her, right? Because people on trains are generally not reliable, right? So that's a super important part of the sort of the hard to read, difficult qualifications. But I think here it matters, right? Because then you say, oh, what if you have a high credence that non-P, right? And so more glitter, right? So the principle describes a default attitude, and of course that can be defeated. So I think there are two options here. One is where we're collaborating and I have high credence that non-P that's based on scientific justification. In that case, I want to say the principle is defeated, right? Because I have it's a case of expert disagreement, and of course. In that case, I want to adjust my antecedent, maybe in accordance with the Bayesian rule or something like that, you know, but I don't want to just like adopt belief or if you're Lockean sort of belief level credence, you know. So in that case, I think, so if I have justification for it, I think it's reasonable to suspend judgment, this is where the discursive requirement is important, because what should happen then, the rational response is to begin to compare the evidence for and against P, see whether they are symmetric, defeating relations. And so this is sort of what I think is distinguishes about these norms is they have, although they're sort of cast in terms of individuals, they have this. The net effect is that they put this focus on communal, rational, collaborative belief revision, right? So I think here the norm actually comes out nice, because that's what it says that should happen, right? If it just sort of clashes with a deeply held commission or an intuition or something of mine. In that case, I think there's no defeat, and then I think the epistemic obligation stands, and and I think there is an obligation to believe or accept, or reach sort of belief acceptance level credences. If I don't have scientific justification, that sort of defeats the higher order clause, right? Modular one thing that, I mean, this is an epistemic norm. So this is a requirement of epistemic rationality that you do the doxastic revision that can be overruled by practical factors in some cases. And of course, there's a big debate in philosophy of science, you know, the tolerance for practical and how to weigh practical versus epistemic things and stuff like that. Here, I just want to flag that there can be cases in which I have like a deeply held commitment that might overrule the, so all things considered, I may not have to form the belief, right? I have views about this, but I think that would take us too far, right? So here actually, I think all the irksome qualifications actually think sort of helps with the so at least immediate the counterexamples, and that's why I had them in, you know. Again, you have some interesting concluding methodological remarks. I mean, you say that there's some sort of unfortunate strains of traditional epistemology focusing. The norms are focused on the individuals, on the producers and hearers in a particular testimonial transaction. But I think the key here is that although they're cast in this way, and I hope to illustrate this with the case we just discussed, that they're norms that are sort of devised and framed by this idea that they're the norms that permits and contributes to truth-conducive collaboration, right? So I think that's sort of the key, and this is why the discursive justification is important, I think, you know. I also think that can be extended to research groups. I mean, I think you could take the H&H and have it be collaborating research groups or research communities. I think those should not be. I don't think you can just adopt the present formulation. I think you need an extension that looks at the. So we'll have subspecies, and that those to get those right, we have to draw on the epistemology of groups and look at case studies in philosophy of science. But I think it's sort of. I think that's sort of an avenue that I think is perfectly compatible with a research program, right? Yeah, then I just wanted to resist. You have sort of this indication that the philosophers of science tend to work more in a credence Bayesian framework, and epistemologists tend to work in sort of a binary belief framework. I just don't think that's sociologically right. I mean, there's lots of Bayesian epistemology. And actually, there's also lots of sort of, I mean, the whole value-free ideal discussion is framed in terms of accepting where that's taken to be a binary notion, right? So I think that's pretty orthogonal, actually. I am interested in thinking about how these norms would be spelled out in a credence decision theoretic or Bayesian framework. And I mean, but I don't think that's actually I don't actually think that's a place where there's sort of deep traditional divides between epistemologists and philosophers of science. Anyhow, super cool stuff. I want to think more about all this. Thanks a ton.
Okay, so we have reached the end of the episode. This was a fantastic discussion. Thanks to the author, thanks to the commentator, and stay tuned for more episodes of the series. Thanks.